Welcome to the Worldbuilding Workshop, the companion podcast to the book of the same name. My name is Stephen Slota, and I am here, as always, with my fellow co-host and co-author, a little bit of Walter White crossed with a lot of bit of Hannibal Lecter,
Trent Hergenrader.
And today we're actually doing something a little bit different. The book that you are reading is actually a shorter version of the book that was written. As is so often the case, there is a word limit. You can't fit everything in that you want to fit in, and as a result, something gets cut. Well, when we started writing this book, I had an academic paper I had written back in 2018 that I wanted to put somewhere. Didn't get around to it, had a lot of other stuff going on. COVID happened, it just sort of got put by the wayside. But there was this idea that had been gnawing at me for a long time. And I ended up writing a theory article that I wanted to publish. And when Trent asked me if I would be willing to contribute to this project, I said, of course. I actually have a chapter that's already written and we can throw it right into the book and it'll be a natural fit. Well, through the review process and editing process, we decided this was probably the easiest thing to cut because it was the most scholarly of the chapters. And I don't mean that as necessarily being a negative, but it did read as if it was meant for a peer review academic journal audience. It just didn't have the same collegial tone or the same approachable tone as the rest of the book. It was a little bit more formal. It was a little bit more reliant on you knowing a lot about game-based learning.
Yeah.
So ultimately, we ended up cutting it. It was our original chapter 6. We're now calling it chapter 5.5 because it was intended to be a bridge between part 1 and part 2. And I think that's what we're going to get into today is what that bridge looks like, why we chose this as a topic to be that bridge, and what the implications would be for anyone trying to do that intentional design work to implement world building in the classroom, what it looks like to characterize the thing you're doing, not just to your students, not just to your peers, not just to parents or other various community members who might be interested in this, but how would you talk about this thing you're doing? And where does it fit in the realm of games in education or playful learning or the other various elements of the learning sciences where you could feasibly talk about this stuff? So that said, the name of this chapter, this lost chapter, is Gamefulness, Playfulness, and Fun. And it's all about a scale developed for the explicit purpose of being able to more effectively characterize the stuff we're talking about doing in a classroom.
What I would say too is that, like, it is a case. It feels like when we were just rereading this to prep for this episode, it's this case of if you know an academic and you ask them a question that is within their field of interest, watch out, right? Because you just dropped a quarter in somebody and they can start talking at a pace in which you didn't even understand that you'd opened the floodgates. And rereading this, that's the thing, is it is very much about games and learning, which we are addressing and which we've talked about a little bit about, I think, in the forward, like our backgrounds and how we met at GLS. But it is the case that a lot of people may just not register what it is, like why it's there. And we had the book, we had our word count, we were right at it without having our bibliography in and things like that. And it was either, can we squeeze a little bit out of every chapter, or do we just whack what was then chapter 6? And that's what we decided to do. But having read it, it's great, and we will do our best to add some context. So if you are absolutely new and you don't understand why we would even be talking about games, we will address some of these things, as well as the word that most of us hate, gamification, and what that is, and hopefully we can drive it out of your vocabulary, or either you talk about it disparagingly or say it's sort of like going to the dentist. Like occasionally it's something that maybe you have to do, but you're not super thrilled about it. So with all of that, Steve, I think I cut you off. What else did you want to say?
I think that's actually a pretty good lead into where I wanted to start anyway, which is that in the prologue, we open very explicitly with that commentary on the word edutainment and gamification being a kind of edutainment. I know for myself, I've been grinding this axe for over 10 years now, like I think 15 years, maybe a little bit longer, but that the word gamification stopped meaning anything to me a long time ago. And the reason why is because it got co-opted as like the educational buzzword that captured every possible conceivable thing you do with a game in a classroom. And that was actually the impetus for writing this chapter or this article or whatever you want to characterize it as. What drove me to write it in the first place was being so frustrated with the way the community talked about gamification. And when I say community, I mean the games and learning community. Also the way educators talked about it. Also the way the media talked about it. It just stopped having a usefulness. And we actually explicitly say in the book when we use the word gamification, if we use it at all, it will only be in the very narrow context of talking about operant conditioning. Basically, you give points or scores or tickets or marbles or whatever it is you give your students in response to doing some activity. Badges actually would fall into this category too. You're probably familiar with badging. We can have more of a conversation about that later. Yeah, exactly. Leaderboards, that sort of thing. That was gamification. And similarly, I would lump in a bunch of stuff that is ostensibly game-based, but is actually much more superficially related to good game-based playful instruction than what you could be implementing in a classroom. So for all intents and purposes, we just don't use the word gamification very often. I would like to drive a stake through its heart. And instead, if I'm going to talk about these things, I try to frame them in terms of either instructional games, which basically means any game you would use to instruct somebody, which I think differentiates it from the behavioral conditioning elements, or serious game, although I don't love that terminology either.
Also
and we do actually talk about that in the book too. Yeah, it's very problematic. And it essentially it gives the impression that a serious game must be unfun or must be some sort of really dark or unpleasant activity that when I think of seriousness, I think of being an accountant in a cubicle who's very focused on the numbers in their spreadsheet. I'm not thinking explicitly about something like world building, which I find to be quite playful and quite fun under the right circumstances. So there's all this jargon that academics started using in the realm of gamification or game-based learning that just stopped meaning anything to everyone. And I think as a result, it necessitated us taking a look at that terminology and figuring out how do we frame these various kinds of activities that could ostensibly be called games or something else. How do we organize them in some sensible way that we can differentiate or aggregate the different kinds of research being done without mischaracterizing the thing we're actually doing. And obviously you all haven't seen the chapter because it was cut, but I very clearly lay out in the beginning, and I'm going to quote some of the book here or the chapter here since you don't have the text, but baseball and World of Warcraft, for example, are non-controversially viewed and treated as games, given their defined rules, goals, and opportunities for creative and strategic thinking. But what about non-traditional game-adjacent activities that feature defined rules, goals, and opportunities for creative problem-solving, like cheerleading, marching band, or driving a car? Or activities that are socially defined as games but lack well-defined end states or scoring criteria, such as Dungeons and Dragons or Minecraft? What about military simulations that include clear rule sets and goals and opportunities for strategic problem-solving but are minimally playful? Because, for instance, it would be quite problematic if a soldier began dancing around like a Fortnite character in the middle of a firefight. That's the end of the quote there. That's in the first opening paragraph of this chapter. And I think it is probably pretty obvious where we're going with this, that those things are all, they could all be called games under different circumstances. And it's not helpful. It's not helpful for all researchers to label those things games. It just ends, if everything's a game, nothing's a game.
And there's also the sense, it's funny because I'm writing an article right now on collaborative world building and tabletop role-playing games, making this argument that the designers are collaboratively building the world of the game, and then the players are collaboratively building their own unique version of that world, choosing some things, leaving some other things out. So it's like double-decker world building is the argument that I'm making in this paper. And I did the same thing, like I was just saying, what is a role-playing game? And in Role-Playing Game Studies, a Transmedia Approach by Jose Zagal and Sebastian Dieterding, which is like the best sort of book right now that is an overview of role-playing games. They go into this question. They've got a 36-page chapter that is just what are all the things that people have called role-playing games, to what extent are these true, right? So this is like more, and again, this doesn't have much to do with, it doesn't really have anything to do, very, very tangentially with world building. But in this case, I said, okay, well, if you're playing Risk, that is a high level, you're not playing as a president of a country, right? You're just you're moving troops around. And then I was saying, and if you're in the backyard playing tag or cops and robbers with your friends, right, you may be playing as a character, Dick Tracy, or I don't think anybody probably has played as Dick Tracy in 50 years. But anyway, you could be playing as characters, but then there's no rules as to, in Risk, you roll the dice, and that tells you who wins, who loses the battle, and you take a piece off. When I shot you, no, you didn't. You didn't get me, right? You shot, but you didn't hit, right? So those are cases of which, okay, well, those are games, and one is more like imagination and play. But on the other hand, there's nothing saying that when we get together and play Risk, that we're all going to make up, I'm going to be Hermann von Schniegeldorf or whatever from Germany, and every time I make a move, I am going to speak in a bad German accent, right? And like I am going to role play this. Well, that's not part of the rules of Risk, but if everybody is doing it, then it is kind of like a role play kind of situation. And then if the kid says, hey, look, every time I shoot, we'll do scissors, paper, rock, and if I win, then that means it hits you, right? Well, then it's like, okay, well, now you've got some sort of rules and a mechanic in there, but to what extent, and, is it fluid or whatever? So I think it's just one of those things that these things are slippery and they slide all around. And one of the things that I've been noticing in the last 5 years or so is the movement towards talking about playful, gameful approaches rather than what we would say. So one of the things, too, that I always like to say, this is where I dismiss gamification as quickly as possible. So in your minds, this is what I'm going to order you to do. Think about gamification as a task that you don't want to do. It is drudge work. It is something that it's unavoidable, but it needs to be done. So the things are like learning basic grammar for a new language, right? Like that's not super compelling stuff, or like getting your steps in when you're walking, when you're trying to do some exercise. So the gamification is Duolingo. You got a dumb little bird that tells you some things, right? And then you get a badge if you come back every 3 days. And if you feel great about your badge, and then your badge turns orange because you came back for a 10-day streak. It has nothing to do with whether you're learning Polish or Spanish or whatever it is. It's just sort of this operant conditioning. You feel good, you peck the bar, you get a pellet, right? So it gives you some motivation. Or the idea of close all your rings with an Apple Watch, or get 10,000 steps with your Fitbit, and better yet, get with your friends at work and create a leaderboard and see who can get the most steps for October. It has nothing to do, like all of those badges that you get, you climb 1,000 stairs, they have nothing to do with the actual exercise. They're just little bits of motivation, right? So then the question is, as we go back, and hopefully you've been listening to all these episodes in order, but if you're not, thinking back to some of the other things that we said, you want to be thinking about the things that you're doing in your classroom every time you go in, right? To be thinking about, what am I trying to get out of this? What am I trying to get out of that? So do you want to put your learners in a position that you are saying, this is drudge work, this is grunt work that you don't want to do, but I'm going to make a game out of it so it's fun, right? We're going to have a leaderboard. We're not going to have grades. We're going to have, if you get 87 feathers, that's a B+. And it's like, oh, because the word point wasn't good enough, right? So it very quickly goes down a rabbit hole into stupidity. And the thing that we would normally, historically, when I was writing and publishing, and I think you're probably in the same camp, we would contrast that kind of gamification, or you keep bringing up Math Blaster. You're flying around your ship blasting aliens, and it has nothing. You have to solve a math problem first, get it, then you get to blast the aliens, right? So it's like there's nothing about the game that aligns with what you're trying to teach. And what we would say is game-based learning is different than gamification, because that's where you're taking your specific learning outcomes and aligning those with specific games that have those rules, right? So you find a game, it's like, oh, well, if I want to bring in Risk, it's like, okay, well, do the mechanics of Risk, of rolling dice, moving armies, all these kind of things, do those help you with the learning outcomes that you specifically have for this project or this class or whatever? And if the answer is yes, or if you need to modify it a little bit, or if you want to bring role play into Risk, like whatever it is you want to do, there's lots of different ways. But I think one of the things that I've noticed too is, as soon as you say game-based learning, people will say, instructors will say, well, I'm interested in this, but I don't like games, or I don't play games much. I don't want to bring in a game. I've never played Risk. I don't understand Risk. I don't want to learn all the rules, right? And it's like, okay, but if you just would you like to be more playful? Would you like to be more gameful? It's not a game, right? It's like you don't need to master it. You just need to sort of like start to think about your class as a way. And this is one of the things too, that there are very many bright people who are new to this, who they instantly will say, well, isn't just students going through college a kind of a game? They learn that they need to accrue certain points called credits that will get them a certificate that is their degree, right? And then they game the system by trying to get credits over here and whatever. And it's like, yeah, see, so you kind of get it, right? Like there are ways that you can start to see about bringing in those kinds of, if the system can be seen as game-like and you want to approach it in a gameful, playful way, then there are strategies that you can lean into without it needing to be this sort of like esoteric, it is not a game because there is no win condition. You know what I mean? It's like, oh, whatever. Right. We have, like where there's some rules, did we adopt some roles? Did we have some fun? Did it get us to where we needed to go to? Fine, right? Don't call it, it's not a game in that case. But it was playful. And I think that, for me at least, is always the way that I describe, usually in one slide. Or I have a slide with Ian Bogost's article, Gamification is Bullshit. That is another one that I will have on the screen, like when I'm going through these presentations, just kind of project, I'm not alone in this. This is something that, a lot of people feel. But I think that alone in these presentations, it's like gamification is something that maybe at the right time, if you're counting dry cleaning bags or, you know what I mean, like that, and you turn it into a race with your friend, like that's a gamification that has nothing to do with anything, right? So it's those kinds of applications that don't have the good learning principles sewn into them in a deep way, and it will not leverage deep learning. But but sometimes if you do have a grunt work to get done, make up a little game, and that's fine. It's things that we typically don't want to be positioning our students as, assuming that they should be resistant to the content that we are teaching. I mean, with that, I said more there than I was planning to. So why don't you talk about the heart of this then, unless you were going to say something else?
Yeah, no, that was really helpful as a lead in to this broader concept, because as you might have concluded listening to what Trent was just talking about, there's a reason to think that the way that we talk about gamification, like if you're putting widgets together on an assembly line, that's pretty closely related to how Csikszentmihalyi talked about flow states. If you're not familiar with flow states, Csikszentmihalyi, who's the researcher who characterized them, talked about how you could be working on that conveyor belt assembly line and you make up a game for yourself or make up some activity, and you get so hyper focused on the thing that you're doing that you just enter flow. And then suddenly this thing is done and time is passing so much more quickly for you than it would have been for somebody else in that position. So ultimately, we're thinking about how do you frame those experiences for yourself? How do you think about the relationship between rule sets and goals and scores, as well as the agency or autonomy or creativity available to you in a given space? And what do those things even have to do with the enjoyment you get out of doing a task? When people will write about, and I say this very generally, but when people will write about games and learning, when they'll publish on this subject, they'll frequently talk about different kinds of activities as if they are all the same thing. And I think this is extremely evident. And the example we used in this chapter was Calvin Ball from Calvin and Hobbes. It becomes very extremely evident that not all of these things have the same parameters. And by calling them games, it's actually unclear what you mean. So is it a thing that you think is a game because it's enjoyable? Is it a thing that's a game because it's playful? Is it a thing that's a game because it had points? Like what is it we're actually talking about here? And there are these other sort of peripheral questions like, how are we deciding if this thing is or isn't a game? And can it become a game or stop being a game? Like if I do my little widget game where I'm trying to get at the high score for every hour, what if I decide I don't want to play that anymore and I stop? Is the activity itself the game, or was it my framing of that activity that was a game, right? And it also raises the question of whether or not these things have to be socially defined and agreed upon a priori. So if I think it's a game, is it a game? Versus if Trent thinks it's a game, is it a game? Or do we have to both agree on that? Or what if neither of us thinks that, but some outside observer thinks that? So again, the reason why this chapter was written was not specifically because I wanted to tell all of you who are listening to this or who have read the book that like you need to worry about this stuff. It's actually mostly an insular fight amongst people who do this for a living, but it also felt kind of important because we wanted you to have the appropriate language to have these conversations. Or in the case of, as Trent was saying, if you're somebody who doesn't like games, at least video games or role-playing games or whatever kind of games, if you're not a gamer and you're a little wary of trying world building because you're worried that it's gamey, I wanted to establish for anyone reading the book that no, that's not really true. Like it's as gameful as you want it to be, and it's as playful as you want it to be. You can do it completely seriously, all buttoned up, and as if there's no room for humor. I mean, personally, I don't think that would be particularly enjoyable. But then again, it depends on the context and the content. So if you're talking about the middle passage, like yeah, it probably makes sense. You don't want that to be super silly and playful. But maybe there are other instances in which you're talking about historical events or you're talking about a philosophical concept where you actually do want it to be a little bit silly. So if you're talking about absurdism, of course that makes sense. If you're deconstructing the world of an absurdist piece of literature, yeah, okay. We actually use that example in the book too, that Monty Python and the Holy Grail is a good example of something you could implement in a classroom to teach a lesson, but the lesson you teach has to actually match the thing that you're presenting to the class. So if we're talking about absurdism or we're talking about satire, then it's a good use of that resource. But if you're teaching, I don't know, Calculus, probably not a great fit. So you need to think through kind of what are the relationships between these media and what we're doing with them in the classroom. And
Yeah.
to go back to what we had said early on, as Trent alluded to in this episode, you need to maintain that 1-to-1 ratio between the activity objective and the learning objective, so that whatever the thing is you're doing in the class is the thing you want somebody to be doing in real life. You don't want to be a math blaster. What you want is to organize some sort of role-playing scenario where your learner is going to be putting together addition and subtraction and multiplication and division in a context where that is a thing you would actually do. I realize that's a huge wind up to the point I'm trying to make. What I boiled all of this down to, or distilled it to, was something that I called the Gamefulness, Playfulness, Fun, or GPF scale. This scale is not meant to be a quantification of these characteristics. It is not meant to be something that is fixed in space and time forever.
Or a value judgment.
Yes,
or a value judgment, yeah.
It's just meant to be a way to differentiate different kinds of activities generally based on their structure and function and form. The gamefulness, each of these characteristics, gamefulness, playfulness, and fun, is treated as a separate spectrum that runs from one end where something is just uniformly one way to the other end where it is uniformly another way. So, for example, gamefulness, or the G, runs from ill-structured interaction, so ill-defined problems, all the way to well-defined quote-unquote games, things that we could all look at and agree that's a game. Like, there's no question, it is socially agreed upon, that's a game. Playfulness, or P, runs from minimized agency, where the user, player, participant doesn't really have a choice in what they're doing. They just kind of have to follow the rule set as prescribed, all the way to total creative freedom, where they have complete agency or autonomy to decide what they're doing in that environment. And then finally, fun, F, is experienced emotionally as unfun, running all the way up to generating unbridled joy. So as you might expect, the way you assess these things is not necessarily uniform. You're not judging the gamefulness, playfulness, and fun the same way for each category. But if you're the researcher who's implementing a game in an environment, trying to gather some data about it, or you're an instructor trying to use a game or some activity in a classroom, you would then adjudicate the thing you're doing based on these three spectra, and then use the appropriate assessment method to evaluate where on this scale you would put a thing. Trent, give me your thoughts. Like, I don't think you had known about this paper before I showed it to you for this book. Like, what was your impression upon hearing that as somebody who also views gamification as horseshit?
Yeah, that's, the thing is too, it's funny because with the world building book that came out in 2018, Collaborative World Building for Writers and Gamers, there's a card deck that goes along with it. And the basic idea, and if you read this book and that book, there's a lot of crossover, but they really are quite different because they're for different purposes. But there are these 4 structural values of governance, economics, social relations, and cultural influences. And then there are 14 substructures that fit underneath those 4 structures, right? So, for example, I'll just do governance is government presence, rule of law, and social services. So those are those 3, and there are 11 more, right? The idea is then that each one of those gets a number, a value from 1 to 5, where 1 means if you have a 1 in government presence, that means that it is not present at all in daily life. You would not know that there is a government here. And a 5 is the government is involved in every aspect of daily life. It is in part of everything, right? And then every value gets one of the, every of these structures, all these 14 structures, get values from 1 to 5 with the idea, and they're not value judgments. I mean, some of them, like race relations or class relations, right? It's hard to say like, oh yeah, really bad race relations is fine, right? Like there are some of these that we do have some value judgments for. But for a 5, you could have anything from a totalitarian regime that is in all your business, or it's like a hippie commune where everybody shares everything about their lives so everyone gets the support they need, right? So it's not necessarily that the government, the government is not like what you would see structured in the same way or whatever. And the real trick to all this, I always say, everybody, it's not a very effective bait and switch because I tell them this right away, that part of the work of this class is defining what does the category mean in this context for your project, and then what does a 1 mean, what does a 2 mean, what does a 3 mean. So if you'd say something like, oh, gender relations or gender equality is a 3, one of the things I would want to ask you is, if gender equality got less, what would that look like? What would it need to do? What would the world look like in order to be a 2? And if it got better, right, or I shouldn't say better, if there were more equality, what would that look like, right? So it's like, the values are not sort of objective. It's just sort of like, okay, this is just like a placeholder. And people will refer to this as the world building game. And I'm like, it's okay, but it's not like it's it's not a game like that, right? It's like a tool that uses deliberately. I designed it using game mechanics and game principles. And the reason why I use a card deck instead of a die is because a die is too random. You want to have a few low values, a few high values, and if it's totally random, then you have no control. Well, if I have 14 cards, I know there are 2 1s and 2 5s in that deck, right? And they will always come up. And then the last part is there are 4 categories that are going to be trending, either trending up or trending down. So there are definitely some game-like aspects to this. They're playing cards, and a lot of people who don't know much about any of this field, immediately, if they see dice or cards, they immediately call it a game, right? Regardless of whether, I would nitpick or whatever. And then at the end of the day, it's like, okay, but is it? Like, you deal the cards out. Is the game collaborative interpretation of what all of these things mean, right? It's like, that's certainly playful. It's certainly gameful. And if they have to resolve decisions, I'll say flip a coin or scissors, paper, rock, or whatever you want to do, right? So there are those kinds of elements. And the whole thing is just to make it accessible to everybody. And this is one of the things, too, as you were talking, I was thinking about a gentleman I know, a professor I know named Martin Corners, who is at the University of Exeter, I believe, who does a lot of work on playfulness. And one of the things that he does is he's got the classic conference icebreakers, but part of the conference icebreaker is it's like, you have to clap once, step once, clap twice, step once, clap twice, step twice, right? That kind of thing. And you it's hard to do. Like, you lose track of what you're doing, and you're doing this with a partner who you've just met, and then you both just sort of giggle, right? Like, oops, I screwed it up that time, or whatever. And he says, the neuroscience says that once you start to laugh a little bit and have a good time, then your inhibitions go down, and you get a much more effective kind of mixer, rather than everybody wanting to, exchange CVs or whatever, and exchange what they've been doing professionally or whatever. So that's his whole thing, is like, you introduce some things like this that are maybe they're well-defined or ill-defined. And in that case, the goal is to produce some fun, right? Like, if you feel ashamed that you couldn't remember the pattern, then it doesn't work. But nobody does, because the expectations are so low, right? So again, like, this would be something where it's like, oh, well, what kind of game is it? Well, plug it into the gameful, playful, fun scale, right? And this is where, too, one of the things, this is a debate, too, whether fun is sort of a 4-letter word in the classroom. Should we, and this is where, again, if you know about these things, designing for fun isn't probably your primary goal. And satisfied.
I would say that's actually a mistaken goal. Like, if you're designing for fun, and I mean, there are exceptions here. Like, if you're, well, I guess it depends on the specific video game too, but like, designing for fun as a game designer is probably what you want to do, because ultimately you want somebody to pay you money for the experience you're creating from them. But it doesn't even have to be fun necessarily. There are the same thing with movies. Like, there are plenty of movies that are not necessarily fun, right? But they're great films. So like, anyway, I'm kind of going down this rabbit hole myself. It's just, there are so many different ways to characterize these things that, to your point about the world building deck and the exercise of trying to do these various steps and having it break down into some silly laughter, the entire purpose of trying to use the scale, these spectra, to talk about this stuff is because you want to make clear what is a thing actually designed to do, and in whether it is effective at that goal. Fun is just one element of it. It doesn't have to be the element of it. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, exactly. I mean, that's all great. And this is where, too, I would say that there are 2 examples from me doing, when I've designed my tabletop role-playing game class, which, again, with world building and tabletop role-playing game class called Game-Based Fiction, these are on steady rotation. I teach them at least once a year, every year, and have been for a very long time. And there was one of the first times, but I have not designed that class for fun. I've designed that for people to get into the perspective of a character who is moving through the world. They have certain advantages, they have certain disadvantages, they're good at certain things, they're bad at certain things, and they don't always succeed, right? So I had a student who, they were trying to do this sort of infiltration thing, and he had this novel idea that it was like, clearly it was the last session of the year, of the semester, and their plan had completely backfired because they'd screwed up all of these. They'd missed all of their roles, right? Like, they got detected right away, all these kind of things. But he ended up, like, the goal was to plant a bomb and get out. And he did the classic, like, I'm just going to strap the bomb to myself and run straight into the middle, right? And I'm like, okay, like, they're going to try and stop you from doing it. And he rolled, a natural 20 or whatever, got 1,000,000 sixes. And he, like, jumped up, flipped his chair over, and shouted, "Yeah!" at the top of his lungs, right? Because his character had just earned, and no one had planned it. Like, I had no idea this was going to happen, right? But he had just earned this epic ending, right? Whereas, like, oh, he kind of saved the day, he sacrificed himself, all these kind of things. And I'm like, okay, great story material, right? And he's like, oh, and he's saying that was so much fun, right? And then just a few years ago, we were playing a different role-playing game. It was Tales from the Loop, which is like Stranger Things, kids in a world where there's some things going on, right? High tech or whatever it is. And same sort of thing. This was the last episode of their campaign, and they're doing this in front of the class. And the student has all the tools they need to fix their little robot that they've been, worried about rescuing or whatever. And she failed the roll. And she had so in the year zero engine, which is the engine that is for this role playing game, you roll 6-sided dice. Anything that's not a 6 is a failure. And she had something like 9 or 10 dice. So the odds are like upper 80% that she's going to get it. And she doesn't. And the whole room goes quiet. And she actually starts to get a little choked up because it's like, well, we don't want to re-roll or whatever. And then it was like, I was actually, and she said, in her final reflection, I was so sad, like it ruined my night, whatever. But it gave her great storytelling material. So at the end of the day, these two students have diametrically opposed kinds of endings for their characters. And both of them have great stories to tell, right? They have a climax that they want to talk about. But it wasn't fun for one of them at all. And it was super fun for the other one, right? And the guy who died, quote unquote, lost. Like, you don't want to die in a tabletop role playing game, And the other, young woman lived to fight another day. And her final scene was this kid in a shed working on his robot because if he ever had that opportunity again, he wanted to make sure that he was going to succeed, right? And I'm like, see, you failed, but it's an excellent story, and that's the point. The point is, get yourself to a place using this methodology where you're playing a role-playing game where the mechanics are going to have you succeed or fail, sometimes with the odds, sometimes against the odds, and the end goal is not fun. The end goal is, do you have the basic material to tell a compelling story, right? And the answer, and that's the point of the class, right? And it's like, okay, well, if you play through the game and you follow through, right, whatever, you should wind up with that, and that is virtually every single time. That's what ends up happening. But fun is not what I designed for. Now, a lot of students will have fun in that class, which is like a happy byproduct. That's like the syrup on the pancake, right? But it's like, that's great. And I'm glad because that made you come back to class and, you look forward to it. And there's all these sort of, social emotional things. So it's definitely not bad. But if you didn't have fun, I don't care. Right, because you still did the work and you still did all the stuff, right? I was thinking too, as you were talking about other things, is like when you've got like the company picnic and they have like the 3-legged race, or you got to run with like real big pants that are full of water or something like that, right? It's taking something like the Olympics and then just being like, this is not about actual athletic ability, right? This is about silliness. This is about laughing. And the reason why corporations used to do this before budget cuts, made it not feasible, was so you could see people in a different environment and start to see them as human beings and lower your guard down, you know what I mean, and all those kind of things. So again, there may be very good reasons for you to want to incorporate fun, or it's like, oh, well, this is a project that you're going to have to do. And maybe it'll be fun and maybe it won't, but that's okay. It's highly playful. There's a little bit of game, and this is what I would say. For world building, highly playful in terms of interpretation, in terms of where you could go, in terms of generating ideas. Minimal game, you know what I mean? Minimal sort of, it's like there are the rules about the cards and whatever the numbers. And so it's like sort of, there's some game, but it's not super gameful. There's certainly not a win condition. And then is it fun? Well, your mileage is going to vary, right? I mean, it's like most students get satisfaction out of it. A lot of them would describe it as fun, but not everybody. And that's fine because, as long as they don't hate it, like that's the other thing too, is like, it doesn't need to be, if you don't have fun, that doesn't mean that you necessarily don't, it doesn't mean that you dislike it or whatever. It's just not something that you would do in your free time. You would not elect to do this, if it were not part of some other kind of experience. And again, and this is where even just me freestyling this, on the scale off the top of my head, it's very, I just thought about this as I was talking, it's very much like that world building deck in which the numbers and the categories have no fixed objective meaning. It's just a starting point to say, this is about where I think it's at. Let's talk through what's it doing, right? Like, and it's not like, oh, this should go from a 4 on the fun scale to a 3. It's 20% too fun. You'll get better results, right? It's like, well, no. I mean, like, it's just like, oh, well, this may be fun, but that's not the goal, so I don't care if it's low. But what I really want to do is, or like, even being able to talk to somebody who is new to this. Well, how much of a game do you want to have? How much play do you want to have, right? Like, you could say, well, let's look at it. Let's put it where it currently is, where we are thinking about it. Let's put it on the scale. Do we want to get more fun? Do we want to get more fun? Do we want to get more gameful or less gameful or whatever?
I would actually say, too, to kind of crib from our chapter on theory to practice, chapter 3, What this all makes me think of is an example Mike Young and I used to use when we were teaching undergraduate students who were going into education about game-based learning, because a lot of them would come in with this mentality, like we've described earlier, that a game must be a video game. It must be oriented in this specific way. It must be fun, whatever. And we used to point out to them that one of the best counterexamples to what they were describing was professional sports, because often those are not experienced as fun. So if you're participating in the Super Bowl or some really important pick your sport final event thing here, the Olympics actually is a pretty good example too, that it's a high anxiety, high stress moment. You have prepared very thoroughly for that thing. It is called a game, but it probably is not very playful because of the fact that the amount of agency that you can exert in that experience or in that context is very low relative to what it would be if you were just, say, messing around with your friends in the backyard.
Yeah.
It's also probably not going to be very fun because of the high stakes nature of it, especially if you lose. And then
or
the
make mistakes, right? Or make
right. Like if you make an error, if you drop the ball, you don't stay on the balance beam, whatever it is you're trying to do. And then the gamefulness is going to be very high because the rule set is extremely well defined and there are going to be definitive scores that are applied to you as you're doing this activity. So we used to use this as an exemplar to say to these students, hey, if you're playing professional football, yes, it's a game. No, it's probably not very much fun in the moment. And your playfulness in that specific setting is probably not very high. But if you were to invert some of those elements, if you were to be playing a pickup game of something in the backyard with your friends, or you were doing something like playing something that's well defined as a game like Minecraft, well, odds are that's going to be experienced quite differently. And so you actually have to account for those differences when you talk about something as being a game or some form of playful learning. And lumping all of that under the umbrella of gamification feels really bad. I don't think that's a useful way to talk about it.
Just real quick, I was going to say one of my advisors, PhD advisors in grad school, was Thomas Malaby, who wrote a very influential essay called Beyond Play: A New Approach to Games. And one of the central ideas there is focused on gambling in these small Greek communities, right? And it's like if you think about a blackjack dealer in a Vegas casino, how much fun are they having? How much playful room do they have? If you don't know blackjack, you know exactly the dealer does not choose. He has to hit or she has to hit when the number is at a certain level, right? And there's a certain condition. So they're kind of automatons, but they're also there to give a human face to it, right? But the people playing, like, we know that people get addicted to gambling. They bet too much, they lose, they start to bring in other kinds of substance abuse or whatever. And it's all overseen by the Nevada Gaming Commission, right? So again, it's one of those things that they are games by definition, but they're not fun, and they certainly can, and they're literal work for some people, and they are, and then there's varying levels of fun.
That's actually what I was about to say, was that we tackled the concept of work in this paper too, or this chapter, whatever you want to call it. Basically said that work is any task completed with total conformity to a given rule set and no innovation or creative problem solving. And so you could say that the task of folding laundry is work, or you could say that playing World of Warcraft is work, but it depends on the conditions that are imposed upon you while you're doing that thing. One of the examples I had given for something that was a high gamefulness, low playfulness, low fun would be World of Warcraft being assigned to you as a task for a class. Like if I told my students, you must go home and play 30 hours of World of Warcraft this week, and you must play according to the rules of the game. You don't get to make up your own activities. You have to do quests. You have to hit X number of experience points. You have to beat these bosses. And I think that I personally, as somebody who had played World of Warcraft, experienced this when I would do high-end raiding, that you'd go and you'd set aside 4 hours, 3 nights a week to go fight the hardest bosses in the game. That very seldom felt fun. It was work, right? Like I was doing this thing with conformity. The amount of agency available to me was pretty low because if I messed up, I almost cursed on this very sacrosanct podcast. But if you messed up, you ultimately would screw over everybody else you were playing with, right? So there were these conditions that were imposed upon you. And likewise, you could be a parent attending the recital or the talent show for your child in middle school, and maybe they're doing a ventriloquism act. Well, I wouldn't call that a game necessarily, although there are some rules. So maybe it's low to moderate on the gameful scale. It's playful in the sense that the student or your child is going to be playing off of the audience. They're going to be watching you as the parent, see how you react, ham it up a little bit, right? There's some agency exerted there. And then in terms of fun, well, that's variable depending on who you are. Are you the parent that's observing, who might be anxious about what your child is doing? Are you the child who might be anxious about what your performance looks like? Are you somebody who's terrified of ventriloquist dummies? Because then it's probably not going to be very fun for you,
exactly. Right? I was going to say, like, a roller coaster is fun for some people and not for others. So.
Yeah, perfect example. So essentially, the GPF scale was meant to just, as you said, be a starting point for that conversation. And if you were to, say, publish a paper and you used this scale to describe the thing you were doing, at least it would allow the people who are investigating whatever your paper was about, at least it would help them understand what you're talking about or what the environmental context was like when this thing was being implemented. Yeah, because there are way too many examples. And I say this as somebody who had read hundreds of papers about game-based learning implementation. And for more on that, go read the review of Ed research paper, Our Princess is in Another Castle, published in 2012. Having read all of those papers, this was a significant problem because people that are implementing psychological quote unquote games had their papers set alongside people who were studying the equivalent of Calvin Ball or who were using World of Warcraft in a classroom. And setting all of those things as equal meant that there was no way to differentiate which of them was actually intended to be a game other than the say-so of the researcher who wrote it that way in their paper.
So this is not a very popular opinion in the wider culture right now, but words actually have meanings. And it's one of those things where I've talked to people before too, and they're like, who are not games people. They're like, oh, well, Dungeons and Dragons is like a simulation of and I'm like, wait, it's not a simulation, right? And they're like, well, for me, it's like a simulation. I'm like, okay, but it's not. It's a like, we're going to have some confusion here if you don't work with me and use the correct terminology, because there are things that are simulations and they're not Dungeons and Dragons, right? So same thing like with the whole gamification. Like, I'm going to use this gamification simulation with Dungeons and Dragons, and it's like everything you've just said is wrong. So like, let's not, like, if you want to talk about this to other people, talk about your work or whatever, then they're going to not understand. If they know games and learning, they're going to think you're doing something completely different. Like all of the specific jargon, all the specific language that we learn in all of our different disciplines, it's there because it means something, right? Like these two things are sort of separate. And this is where, what I keep coming back to is this idea that being able to master something or feel like yesterday I couldn't do this thing or I couldn't understand it, and today I do, is gratifying. And it's interesting that people will say this is fun now, right? You know what I mean? Or whatever. So this is where I always kind of, when I was in graduate school, I was like, please do not say this class was fun, right? Say it was engaging, say it was enlightening, say it was all these other things, right? But don't say it was fun, because there's only one person in my, one faculty member in the or maybe two in my program who really understood what it was that I was doing. Many more were like, you're just having them play games so they have fun, right? And it's like, okay, what you're saying is fun, but what you mean is something else. And as a writing instructor, I'm going to plead with you, please say, so, please use a different word. I was also thinking too about our favorite, GLS things that would drive us crazy back in the day. And the thing that would always, as somebody who's a writing instructor, specifically a fiction writing instructor, people who use plot, story, narrative all interchangeably, it's like, look, people, you can have a great story and a bad narrative. You know what I mean? Like, you can have a plot that doesn't have a story. Like, they're different things, and you're not going to be able to improve. I remember listening to one presentation where the presenter, used all three in different ways, and they were all wrong. And I was just like, oh, man. And you don't want to go in all, guns blazing and being like, you don't know what you're talking about. But it's like, actually, you can fix your problem if you're able to articulate it using the language, that you need.
Well, precision of language. I think that, Mike Young used to say this to me all the time. He would criticize me for using flowery language in my writing because I liked it to be more prose-like and less academic and dry. And one of the things, it's kind of funny because he and my other advisor, Roger Travis, would have very opposite opinions about that Mike would say, do the dry, correct, precise wording. Roger would say, actually, it's good to have language that is fluid and it sounds nice and whatever, the aesthetics of language. So I did get that experience from two different people. But Mike's argument regarding precision was that when you're talking about cognition or when you're talking about learning theory or when you're talking about the learning sciences, these words actually mean things to the scientists who defined them. And if you're going to intelligibly talk about that topic, it's actually really important that you
Yeah.
use the correct word, because the framework associated with that word can mean very different things to different people, as you were saying, with respect to English language or with respect to the way that people talk about stories versus narratives versus plots. And in the particular instance of situated cognition, the word knowledge or the word knowing is the same word as is used for other kinds of cognitive frameworks too. So it actually matters not just which words you use, but how you're defining your own worldview when you talk
Mm-hmm.
about those specific words. And I realize that if you're still listening to this conversation, that it probably all just seems like dumb semantics. And
Yeah.
to some extent, I do feel like old man yells at cloud. Like this
Right.
isn't a thing that really
Right.
matters and isn't that important. This is not life or death, but it is one of those things that if as a community of scholars, as a community of implementers of this kind of stuff, we're running into that same problem. Like you
Yeah.
can't just use the words wantonly or interchangeably or as synonyms, because they actually do mean different things.
Right.
And so
Right.
the point of using the GPF scale was mostly to calibrate the language so that we're mostly talking about the same stuff
Yeah.
and not leading each other down these weird pathways that don't actually that end in some bridge to nowhere or escalator to nowhere.
Yeah.
If you can't communicate them effectively, you're never going to be able to get at those underlying challenges or the questions you actually do want to empirically study.
Yep. And it's one of those things too. It's funny because as you were talking and as we were getting into the weeds, because I mean, it feels good. I always loved the games and learning community, and GLS was like the home for all of us. And you'd go and you could talk the talk, and they're all your, all the weirdos who are doing the same things or whatever. And it's nice to go back, and I haven't done a lot of that work in so many years. But I think one of the things too, as we've been talking and I've been thinking, is that for people who are reading the book and listening to the show, just have a general idea that these things are at play. You know what I mean? Like you don't need to know exactly what Vygotsky was talking about, right? You don't need to be able to stand up and say, this is the moment where this theory comes into play. Just, we wanted to be able to say, because of this sense that play sounds fun and fun sounds unserious, and how am I going to have rigor when I'm using a game? It's like, no, look. And this is where, too, I think I said this the other day, that I've had students before, because I teach in the same very offbeat, tell lots of jokes, lots of weird non sequiturs, whatever. And then occasionally, I'll give a talk on campus or whatever, and then I'm like the professor, right? And then students will say to me afterwards, like, I had no idea you could do that, right? Like, you could turn the switch, and it's like, okay, well, for somebody who studies role-playing games, it's pretty obvious that I could wear a hat. And again, it's like, I'm silly in the classroom because I tried being formal and I hated it. And I'm just sort of like a silly, off-the-cuff, sort of black humor kind of guy anyway, right? But again, it's one of those things, as I started to learn more about learning, making funny jokes, weird wordplay, whatever, pointing out something, all those things can soften up your audience a little bit, right? So it's like they're more receptive if they're laughing. And I'm not saying this is a do or die assignment, right? It's like we're just going to do lots of experimenting, run through lots of different things. All of that is just to say that the first third of the book, the section 1, is really just saying, hey, look, if you want to find out more about this, here are some places that you could go and find out more about it. Otherwise, just know that like what you're doing to get your students, when they turn and look at each other and start to make their own goals, that's what's a community of practice, right? I mean, like that's what that's called. If you want to talk about it, if you're going to try and publish on this, or if you want to talk to somebody, that's what it's called. So call it that, and not something else, right? And it's like, but you don't need to know anything more about it other than these are, the citations. Go read the stuff if you're interested in it, because I've not read most of it, right? This is the thing, is for most of the citations in the front of the book, I haven't even read it, and I don't care, because it's like I get out of it. I do the things that are laid out under this learning science, under these learning theories, and I've had great results. So you can do the same thing. And it's also in world building. This is where it's deliberate. I mean, this is something that is very deliberate, is that if you've got the category of wealth distribution or class relations or whatever, the people in the group need to come up with a consensus for how they are going to use it in that project, right? That is part of the work of the class. If they do the second half of the semester and they change worlds, they may define that in a different way. So it's not that wealth distribution has no meaning whatsoever, but neither does it have this objective meaning where it needs to mean the same exact thing every time. That is negotiated. And again, this is one of those things where, whatever, that negotiation of those students figuring out what that means, coming up with different interpretations in a rapid fire, throw everything out, shoot it up, shoot it down. There are educational psychology reasons why that makes them a more coherent group, right? It makes their communication more effective. It's like, I don't know what exactly it is. All I know is that's what happens. And it happens consistently because we are human beings with human psychology, right? So I wouldn't be able to present at, an education conference saying, these are the theories at play. But again, I know enough to understand them, to know what I'm doing, and to get the result that I'm after.
I think we actually say somewhere in the book, I don't remember which chapter it is, but it actually might be chapter 3. So you may have already read this if you've gone through the beginning of the book. But I essentially had written that the goal here is not for you to create some kind of replicable empirical research, right? To your point about knowing the jargon or knowing the language, it's not really meant to make you a scientist of this stuff. It's to give you the foundation necessary to communicate about it so that when you're explaining it to your classes, when you're explaining it to your colleagues, you can basically give them the too long didn't read version of all of this and maybe steer them away from some of their misconceptions about this stuff. I kept thinking when you were talking about gamification earlier, that was the whole point of the phrase chocolate covered broccoli, was to basically characterize gamification stuff. And I would say that in terms of whether or not you're trying to make your class fun for your students, gamification ain't it. That's not the thing that's going to be successful. What's going to be successful, again, is finding ways to give the learners some agency, give them some kind of rule set, and allow them to decide what they want to do with that space and that rule set, with you being the person who facilitates the whole thing. And I'll give you a quick example. The two of my favorite activities when I would teach my interactive storytelling class, one of them was, and mind you, the people taking this class were undergraduates. They were 19 to 22, 23 years old. I would have them read Dr. Seuss's Fox and Socks out loud and do popcorn reading like you did in elementary school. And it was a very silly activity that resulted in a lot of them laughing, but was actually towards some instructional end because there was an intended one-to-one relationship between the learning objective, which was to understand the various ways that language can be used for a particularly silly end in the case of Fox and Socks, in addition to it being aligned with the activity objective, which is to read rhyming words out loud and hear how silly they sound. Likewise, I would do an activity where I made the students, or asked the students, I didn't make them, I asked them to write alliterative stories. So you have to write an entire story using only words that begin with the same letter. Some of the best writing I ever got out of my students was doing that activity because it forced them to move away from the conventions of writing they had basically had shoved down their throats for 12 years or 15 years or whatever. And my favorite one, I won't out the student's name, but it was a short story in which the entire thing was about a caveman. And so the explanation for why the entire thing sounded as absurd as it did is because it's being recited in the second person by a caveman to the audience. I think it was Oog was the name of the caveman. So every word started with the letter O. It just was such an exceptional example of how this stuff can be playful while being minimally gameful, but also fun for people. And that's, I know we keep kind of circling around this over and over again, but that was the driving reason that this was the connecting tissue between the first part of the book and the second part of the book. That we wanted you to know the learning theory for the sake of being able to have these conversations, but that was then going to be the basis on which you built the world building stuff.
And this is where too, my work in writing studies and creative writing studies, there's a lot of lore is what we call, where it's just simple, I would say that using active verbs is sort of like a bit of lore, right? I mean, it's not really a hard and fast rule, but more or less that's kind of what you want to do. And I always liken it in this case to home remedies, right? Or what people were doing before they understood medicine, right? Well, if you rub this leaf on your arm, that helps. And it's oh, well, now we would use aloe. But it turns out that that's what's in the leaf. So they were right. They just didn't know why they were right. They didn't know why that leaf had the properties it did, right? And we're oh, well, we understand now that it's got this chemical composition and blah, 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 blah. That doesn't mean that they were wrong. But then again, it's okay, well, if you dangle a quarter over a pregnant woman's stomach, you are never going to be able to tell what the gender of the baby is. So I mean, if you don't understand why one of those works and the other one doesn't, then you need to you need to not be in the conversation, right? Or at least not claiming this is what we ought to be doing, right? And you
should be running the Department of Health and Human Services is what you should be doing.
Exactly. But that's where, too, there's a lot of stuff. I mean, this comes so much from the field of creative writing. first thing you do before you wake up, before you have a single cup of coffee, write at least, for an hour. And it's like, okay, that may work for you. There is absolutely nothing scientific that says that is going to help. Try it. See if it helps. You know what I mean? But there is no, it's like, there's nothing about the receptors in our brain that make us more agile writers first thing in the morning. It's just like, that's one person's practice that works for them. And this is maybe, the case, I'll just tie this up because I could talk about this kind of stuff forever. But it's like, you got to figure out your own personal practice, right? This is the thing in which there are lots, and I always say that this is why you've got a million books on how to write fiction and how to get your fiction published. And the reason why there's a million of them is because if it was that easy, you would just need one, right? You would just need, this is the book on how to get your fiction published, because it's so much harder than that, because the context for every story needs to be doing different things in different places. And it's the same thing with this book and all the different people who are hopefully reading and listening to this podcast, right? You're all going to be in different places. You're all going to have different circumstances from semester to semester, from class to class. You need to be able to understand enough to adjust what you're doing to fit the context for the problem or the issue that you're trying to address in these specific classes. It is not you're going to apply this thing and it is going to work. It is, if you understand how all of these things work, you may understand why a simulation is killing it in this class and a little role play exercise is perfect. Or, you know what? I'm going to build this really elaborate 15-week evolving role play with elements of simulation. Or in week 12, I'm going to do this one activity on this day, right? That's the only thing we're going to do. Both of those are perfectly crumulent solutions, right?
The first thing that came to mind as you were describing that is it's situated. All of this is just situated.
That's
right?
Like, way to bring in the language. We were just talking about specificity.
I know. We're talking about the language doesn't matter, but it's situated, and that's it. All we're trying to do is give you the tools to understand how to massage this practice into your specific learning environment. And that's actually one of the reasons we haven't talked about this either at all. But I tried really hard to make sure while we were writing that this could be usable by people in all different kinds of teaching and learning environments, not just K-12 or higher ed, that corporate training, military training, healthcare training, all the various places you could see this happening, that it would be viable there, because I think there's utility to it. And that's another reason why I viewed part one and then this chapter as being a useful leapfrog position for somebody just getting into this, that it gives you just enough of this stuff to realize that what we're saying isn't bullshit, and that there actually is a reason to try it, and that there are many, perhaps infinite numbers of ways you could implement this based on your specific situation and based on the specific learners you're working with and based on your specific learning objectives. It is applicable across the board.
The idea too that it's not a win-lose kind of situation. You will try things, and I do this all the time. I've developed some sort of in-class exercise, and it's tanking. It is doing terrible. And I'll just say, stop. We're not doing this anymore, right? I thought I was going to do this certain thing, and it isn't. And sometimes, there have been times in which the class is just dead. And I'm like, you all need to be drinking more coffee because you're all very, saying that sarcastically, but you're very dead. So let's not force it. This is just not working the way that I thought it was going to work. And then the same thing too. And this is why when we'd said in one of the previous episodes, the majority of people who try this once, number one, I don't think I ever know anybody who said I'm never going to do it again because it was a total failure. It always works. It works in unpredictable ways that they hadn't intended and achieves a lot of what they had intended, and then they want to tweak, right? I want to tweak this. I didn't quite do this. I want to bring this in. I want to do that, right? So I think that's really important too, that it is not something that it's more, I always say it's like a big Rube Goldberg machine in which the semester is a Rube Goldberg machine. If you don't know, that's one of those things where, what's the definition of it? It's like an overly elaborate contraption for doing something relatively simple, right? So it's like,
I think that's a pretty good explanation.
Dropping an Alka-Seltzer tablet into a water, but you need to have a golf ball hit a shoe that falls off whatever. That's the Rube Goldberg machine. And as we know, if you've ever tried to build one, or like a whole line of dominoes, well, sometimes they're just a little bit too far apart. You got to walk up and knock it with your finger, right? You know what I mean? So it's like, I've got a 10,000 domino maze that's set up or whatever that I'm going to set off. And somewhere in the middle, I needed to nudge it. So it kept going. But it worked almost all of the way. And no one cared that was that one little hiccup. So I was going to say, too, just as like an addendum, that one of the things, there are a couple things that I love. I love fixing drafty stories that are not quite there. And I always tell my students, like, once you get to that point, boy, buckle in, because I'm going to lay into you with ideas that you could use to bring this to what I would say is sort of like the next level, have it gel a little bit. And it is the exact same thing when people say, I need to redesign my intro to Western Civ and I want to bring a game. I'm like, I want to bring a game, I want to make it playful, I want to bring world building. I just got an email today from a colleague who said, I'd like to try and bring in a role play scenario. And like my heart was like, oh God, I can hardly wait. You know what I mean? Like, when can we meet so I can talk about this stuff, right? And it's like, I love doing this, right? It's like, it's so much fun to sort of share the joy and whatever, as opposed to, giving a presentation and being like, everyone in the College of Liberal Arts, you need to bring games into your, if they're coming to me, they've got the right attitude, they're open to experimentation, and then it's a lot of fun to figure out, okay, well, what do you teach? You're in sociology and anthropology. What is it that you teach? What is it you're trying to get across, right? And then saying like, okay, what kind of games? What kind of role play are you talking about? You're not talking about a simulation, are you? Because that's different.
It's all, well, that's all the stuff we laid out in chapter 3 is like, how do you do instructional design? And I think it curves right back to it, that as you're doing this stuff, you do that constant iteration, you evaluate, you redesign, redevelop, re-implement, collect more data. And I realize that makes it sound like it is a scientific endeavor, but it's not. I mean, it's a personalized approach to instructional refinement. And it can be as scientific as you want. Like, you could do research studies on this. I have had students, I have myself done actual scientific research on some of these things. But with respect to designing a world building course or world building activity, a lot of it is just feeling out what's working and what's not, and then refining often on the fly. But like you were saying, you just change an activity midstream and go, you know what, that's not working, let's try something else. And it's same for role playing, same for simulation.
Yeah, that's what I was just going to say. So we've said, world modeling, simulation, and play. You may do almost no world modeling, all simulation, no play. You know what I mean? And it's like, okay, and then that simulation, where does it fall on the gameful, playful, fun scale, right? So it's like, you start to get this matrix. And again, it's not about the precision, about saying run it through the worldometer and it'll give you your report for where it is in terms of how fun versus, how much of a simulation or whatever. It's like just knowing what it is, almost reverse engineering. You know what the outcome is that you want, right? Which should be student learning of some kind.
Yeah.
And then starting to think back, what are the kinds of activities that we do? How do those activities align with different types of simulations or role play, or, would a world simulation be in here? All those kind of questions. And then starting to go through lots and lots and lots of different options. And a big one, and this is one of the things that we're going to be transitioning to, is how much time do you want to give over to this? Because this is another thing too, because people will often bite off more than they can chew. They think that it needs to be something that is elaborate, and whatever, and they're going to do it in 2 class periods. And it's like, that ain't going to happen. It's going to take you 1 class period just to get the students on side, just for them to understand what it is that you want to do, right? So, and it's one of those things too, that's where our expertise comes in from having done this so many times. You're not going to get the result that you want if this is the way. I mean, try it if you want, but results have shown that this leads to this kind of problem. And 9 times out of 10, just like those first timers at GLS, when they explain their methodology and you're like, you want to buzz in with your buzzer, can I guess what went wrong? Because I'm going to tell you, I can tell right now, the way that you set this up, there's something, something went wrong, and I'm sure I know what it is. So anyway, okay, well, we're again, I feel like it's my self-appointed job being the taskmaster that I am. What do you want to say to wrap this one up?
Well, I figured this is actually probably a good opportunity for you to give us a little preview of what part 2 of the book is about, and give an overview of the kinds of topics we'll probably be discussing in the next couple of episodes.
Yeah, so as we start to move in, part 2 is the terminology for the world building, and then part 3 is the how it actually, where the theory meets the practice, how you actually will employ it in your classes. So as I had mentioned, talking about the structures and substructures of a society, thinking about the scope, sequence, and perspective for dialing in how big of a world is it, if it's really zoomed out, if you're thinking about this as like a Google map, if it's really zoomed out, you're going to be making more broad generalizations. If you're zoomed in super tight to just the campus that you're on, then you can make much more specific claims about the people who are there, demographics, things like that. And then just thinking about the terminology and how the terminology is the general idea. And we talk about Wikipedia. We get into Wikipedia quite a bit in this section as well, because Wikipedia is a great example of collaborative knowledge construction, in which they do a lot of, most people will say this, and there is a minority that will say this, or people are very divided, right? It's close to 50-50, or some conspiracy theorists, like, 1% of the people say this, but everybody else knows this other thing. I mean, Wikipedia for me is a great example, because when we're doing the world building, I do recommend that you use a wiki, a specific world building wiki that we can talk about more. But it's that idea that's how, at least in this moment in 2025, seems as good as any, is how we get knowledge is ask a lot of people to contribute their views on this, and then consensus starts with experts and one-offs and everything like that, and then through all of that collaboration and vetting, there becomes a consensus that it's like, well, most reasonable people would say these are the things that are happening. So we'll get into all of this, and again, they're really it's just trying to say, okay, here are the tools in the toolbox for this section that you will take out. Here's what the jigsaw does. Here's what the router does. Right, kind of walking through, and again, why it's useful to be able to understand when you say, oh, I think your scope is too big, or what you're, that kind of thing. It's like, if that doesn't mean anything to your students, then that's a problem. So it's a little bit better if you're all working with the same grammar. And it's easy, it's pretty intuitive. But yeah, so that's what's coming up.
Great. I'm looking forward to it. I love getting into those conversations. I'm hoping it'll give us some opportunity to discuss our favorite media and some of the ways we would characterize them using the world building system, not least of all Andor or
That's
Breaking Bad, The Sopranos, all of the Severance I would put in that category too. Lots of interesting world building examples, also from things that are not film or television, games, graphic novels,
but that's right.
So
to use, and this is where I don't want to get into this, but this whole idea of how we use the word, what is a world, too, right? A show like Severance, like, it seems like they're going from the world of the outies to the world of the innies, right? It's the same planet, it's the same city, it's the same building, but they're moving between worlds when they take the elevator down. If you haven't seen the show, it's just basically they have two different, completely separated identities between the one they have at work and the one they have outside of work.
Yeah, we're gonna have to give it like spoiler warnings, I guess, if we're gonna go into some of these things. So we'll have to think about that before we get there. But thank you for that little preview, and I'm really, like I said, looking forward to the next part of this journey.
Awesome. All right, that was good, and we will talk again soon.
The World Building Workshop podcast is a production of Trent Hergenrader and Steven Slota. Our theme song, Stompin' at Midnight, is a copyright-free Creative Commons production created by composer Kevin MacLeod. The show is mixed and edited by Steven Slota. The companion text, The World Building Workshop, Teaching Critical Thinking and Empathy Through World Modeling, Simulation, and Play, is published by the MIT Press, copyright 2025. Print copies can be purchased through the MIT Press website. The audiobook version, narrated by Steven Slota, is available at www.theworldbuildingworkshop.com.